Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to session number 6, Sustaining and Improving WTO Rules for Sustainable Development Purposes and the Role of G20. I'm Said Akman, Director of G20 Studies Center at TEPAV in Turkey, and also steering committee member of TURN, Trade and Investment Research Network, which is organizing institution of this session. TURN is a cross-country independent network of trade and investment policy researchers whose shared goal is to provide substantive and research-based analysis to support the deliberations of G20 leaders. And you can reach more information about it through its website. As you all know, G20 declarations always called for substantial action on sustainability issues and sustainable development with respect to rising inequalities, sustainability of the global value chains, tackling the impact of COVID-19 on economic and trade matters, and tackling climate change. So our session today is more about trade, of course, and what is the role of trade and functioning multilateral trading system? What should be the role of WTO in the context of sustainability issues? Of course, we all know that trade delivers not only growth, but also development. And we need sustainable development. It's always stated that a rules-based trading system and a functioning WTO are central to achieving 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So in this context, what is actually going on is to reduce trade barriers, to overcome poverty, to overcome hunger, and this serves to achieving SDG 1 and SDG 2 especially. In this context, we need to curtail barriers on food exports to achieve food security. We also have the health initiative, trade and health initiative, which could be useful for affording medical goods and vaccines, which will serve to SDG 3. And also we need to eliminate harmful subsidies, especially on fisheries, which is relevant to SDG 14. So these steps are important, of course, and vital, but they are not enough. What we need is an operating WTO. It's crippling at the moment with its 3 main functions are not effective, and there are calls for urgent reform. And we need to modernize its trade rules, its rule book, actually. So this brings to me the first question in my mind. Our sustainable development goals are well addressed sufficiently in the WTO reform debate? And if not, how can they be better embedded in this debate? Moving from this point, let me say, in the context of a sustainable development, the next major challenge is the climate change. And many SDGs are relevant to the protection of environment. G20 countries in this context are the greatest polluters of the environment and are responsible for a significant share of global carbon emission. But they continue to invest into fossil fuel industries, and G20, as I see, is not on track for a 1.5 degree centigrade world temperature targets. On the other hand, in the face of this climate urgency, what we see that trade agreements, including regional agreements and at the multilateral level, they give rise to ambitious rules to address climate change. And many WTO provisions also allow its member states to provide effective responses to environmental challenges, notably climate change and protection of biodiversity. So in this context, WTO members and mostly the G20 countries also took more than 4,000 trade measures in the last decade just to address climate change. And most of these measures are relevant to the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, technical barriers to trade, agriculture, and import licensing. Moreover, there is the transition to low carbon economy, especially initiated by the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the European Union, which necessitates a functioning carbon pricing system, without which a carbon border tax will be inevitable. So this tax must function to serve environmental protection. Of course, this is expected, and not to serve for trade protection. So this climate debate brings me to the second question in my mind. What should be the role of G20 to play to reinvigorate the centricity of the WTO in the system, in line with tackling climate challenges and contributing to carbon neutrality? And finally, in combining these two questions, I can say, how can we fit WTO into this new narrative about sustainability for itself, the WTO, to be sustainable and to stay relevant? So this panel brings, on the lines of these questions, 4 distinguished speakers, and the session will be moderated by my colleague, Clara Brandi, from the German Development Institute, who is going to introduce our panelists. So I would like to hand it over to Clara to start and to moderate.
Thank you very much, Said, and thank you very much for having me here and for organizing the session on behalf of the Turn Network. Yes, so we all agree the WTO needs to be reformed to strengthen multilateralism and to tackle current and future challenges, including sustainable development. The WTO in general should be better aligned with sustainable development objectives. Our panel today aims to discuss the role of the G20 in this context and which role the G20 can play in reinvigorating the centricity of the WTO in line with sustainable development objectives. And we have an excellent lineup of speakers today. I will have the pleasure of giving them the floor one after the other and introducing them one by one after my short input. So after a short input from my side on the reform of WTO challenges, we will then have our excellent 3 speakers providing their perspectives. And after this, it's time for all of you here in the session to share your perspectives, to ask your questions, to pose your comments, and to contribute to the debate. So we hope to leave enough time for Q&A with all of you. If you do have a question or a comment, please just write a C or a Q into the chat, and we'll be happy to give you the floor later in our Q&A part of the session. You can also type some details on your questions or comments into the chat. Without further ado, let us get started with the content of this session. So as we all know, discussions on reforming the WTO are necessary and have intensified. The G20 plays a key role in this. In 2018 already, the need for WTO reform was officially recognized by the leaders of the G20 in Buenos Aires. But it's a complex agenda, and there are stark differences between different countries on possible reform options. So a key question is, how can WTO reform processes be supported? One key forum to facilitate WTO reform is the G20. Why is the G20 important? I think there are 4 key points that we can briefly mention. Of course, the G20's importance stems from the fact that it brings together leaders from economically significant countries, representing 80% of world trade, as well as relevant international organizations. But the G20 also brings together not only governmental, but also increasingly societal actors from traditional, but also emerging powers. Thirdly, the G20 is a dialogue-oriented forum that can, I think, operate relatively freely, irrespective of formal mandates or negotiating settings, and this can be a chance. Last but not least, G20 members have been actively submitting multiple proposals for WTO reform over the past few months, as there have been numerous proposals for reform tabled and discussed in the WTO context. Our analysis, together with my co-author Axel Berger, of these various positions of different WTO members on the multiple key issues on the reform agenda, show that there are strongly differing views across WTO members on many issues, but that there is also potential for some convergence or perhaps for bargaining across key issues. And we looked in particular at 4 key issues. of course, dispute settlement, the definition of and status of developing countries in the WTO, of course, a key issue from a sustainable development perspective. Thirdly, new rules in the WTO, and then also transparency and committee work in the WTO. So very briefly, we all know that dispute settlement is a particularly contested topic, with the US remaining critical on independent and judicialized dispute settlement systems in the WTO, and having so far rejected proposals for reform. And to go forward, we might need to know more about the conditions under which the US would unblock the appellate body. Secondly, the definition of developing countries in the WTO also remains highly controversial. We all know that it's a system of self-designation. So countries can self-designate themselves as developing countries and then be subject to special and differential treatment in the WTO. So this remains highly controversial, with China, India, and South Africa, among others, as key G20 members, strongly rejecting proposals for reform, for example, tabled by the US. Thirdly, of course, a key issue are discussions on new rules in the WTO. And they are also heated, as we know. Of course, on fishery subsidies, it would be key to finally have an agreement. But also on issues, but there's also debate about new issues such as technology transfer, new rules on technology transfer, perhaps industrial subsidies. And of course, especially from an SDG perspective, as we already mentioned by Said, an agreement on fishery subsidies would be key. In this context, a key question is also how to revive the negotiating function of the WTO. And plurilateral cooperation can in this context be a key stepping stone for closer integration on issues for which multilateral consensus is not yet in sight. But a close analysis of older and also current plurilaterals shows that they are largely initiated by developed countries and are not generally accepted as a negotiation method for all and by all WTO members. Last but not least, there are some less debated, more technical issues surrounding WTO reform, above all on transparency and committee work. And these issues might entail the potential to forge a compromise and make progress on WTO reform. So in light of the contrasting views of WTO members and the complex reform agenda, the key question is really how to make progress on WTO reform and on the role of the G20 in this context. And I will sketch out briefly 4 entry points that we might want to take up in the discussion later today. First of all, G20 leaders can help to keep the momentum for reform. So, for example, the Indonesian G20 presidency should engage key stakeholders of the trading system in a dialogue on WTO reform. And in close coordination with the G20 Troika, the Indonesian presidency could propose a multi-year agenda to prioritize WTO reform and initiatives that help promote the SDGs. The new G20 presidency could, for example, include the G20 engagement groups in this dialogue and seek their input on substantive WTO reform options. One option is also to initiate an eminent trade expert group that reports on an annual basis on this process. Second entry point for G20. The G20 can help to promote a dialogue on WTO reform and on possible compromises across the different issue areas. Since convergence is not very likely on single issues, it might be an option to work towards bargains across different issue areas. And one example that comes to mind is perhaps involving making progress by involving a group of larger developing countries, including offers by Brazil and also countries like South Korea, to relinquish their demand for special differential treatment in exchange for more progress on US agreement on the nomination of appellate body members. The G20 in turn can play a key role in facilitating discussion about such issue linkages in order to hopefully promote more systemic approach to WTO reform. In terms of the third entry point, and that's key for the SDGs, the G20 can bring together different actors from not only the trade realm, but also other policy areas, including the environment and health. So we all agree that more coherent policymaking is needed in view of promoting the SDGs. Trade in goods and services can be a key enabler of domestic growth and revenue creation, and of course also for COVID-19 recovery. But it can also help diffuse environmental technologies and can help to tackle global challenges by providing medical equipment and medicine. So in light of this, the Indonesian presidency should consider engaging other ministers, including, for example, finance, environment, and health ministers in discussions about WTO reform. Joint ministerial conferences or joint deliverables of the various G20 work streams could be an effective tool in promoting WTO reform, also in light of the current challenges with SDG implementation. And last but not least, the fourth entry point concerns plurilateral initiatives and leveraging their potential. And I can here refer you to a recent publication by authors, part of the TURN network, who organized the session, who provided excellent insights into how to boost the potential of plurilaterals. And they argue that the informality of the G20 provides an opportunity to exchange views and establish trust, to find a common ground on plurilaterals. To enhance this discussion on plurilaterals within the G20, the Indonesian presidency could establish a subcommittee under the G20 Trade and Investment Working Group to initiate and lead discussions on the role of plurilateral negotiations within the WTO and their reform potentially. And key recommendations by the TURN include, for example, focusing on development aspects to make sure that these plurilaterals are inclusive, avoiding negative effects for outsiders, conducting ex ante, but also ex post evaluations on plurilaterals, and in general, increasing transparency, including for the general public, to establish trust on plurilateral negotiations. So these are 4 entry points potentially for the G20 to drive WTO reform, also in light of sustainable development objectives. And it's now my pleasure to hand over to our next speaker and introduce to you Caroline Deer-Bergbeck. She's the director of the she's the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs, TESS, and also a senior researcher at the Graduate Institute. And it will be our pleasure to hear from her, her assessment of recent initiatives on new rulemaking in the WTO that can actually entail a lot of potential for promoting sustainable development objectives, especially in the context of the environment. And without further ado, welcome, Caroline, and over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Clara, for the introduction, and also to all of you at the Trade and Investment Research Network for the invitation to join you today. It's really a pleasure to be here on behalf of TESS. The Forum on Trade, Environment, and SDGs is a partnership of the Graduate Institute and UNEP. We were created earlier this year with a focus on supporting dialogue and action on trade and trade policies that address global environmental crises while advancing implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So a key focus on our work is trying to support developing countries and their stakeholders to participate in dialogue and these discussions. And it's really great to be in this discussion today. So I think that in his opening remarks, Said already and Clara already set out some of the range of sustainable development issues that are already on the agenda of the WTO. So these include ending harmful fisheries subsidies, work on sustainable agriculture and food security, work on trade and public health and the pandemic, discussions on gender, and also on micro and small and medium-sized enterprises, which are key to sustainable development prospects in many developing countries. But in the lead up to MC12, which was supposed to be taking place this week, a broad array of WTO members have also been working to foster enhanced multilateral cooperation on environmental sustainability at the WTO. Now, I think it's really important from the outset to say this is just one piece of a much wider reform agenda and one piece of the sustainable development agenda as well. But I do think at the heart of this growing interest of members in environment issues at the WTO is there's a recognition of the need to ensure that the trading system is part of the solution to urgent environmental crises that affect equally developed and developing countries and their trade, but also in the way that we need to do this in a way that's inclusive and fair and takes into account wider social and economic aspects of sustainable development. So I thought I would just start by quickly running through what's on the table. So at MC12, members were expected to launch 3 ministerial statements on the environment, each supported by different groupings of members. Some members supported just one, others supported all 3. And some members, of course, have co-sponsored none of these. Our members are currently considering how and when to proceed with the launch of these statements, given the postponement of MC12. But there is definitely a commitment to sustaining the momentum of those statements and to moving forward with the work. So hopefully we'll see an announcement in the coming week or so of how they intend to proceed. So what are these statements? There are 3 on the table. The first one is a statement on trade and environmental sustainability. This has over 60 co-sponsors. There's another one on plastic pollution and environmentally sustainable plastics trade. This also has over 60 members. And the third statement is on fossil fuel subsidy reform, which has currently, I believe, 43 members as co-sponsors. In my remarks here today, I'll focus on the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, because these are the sort of broadest ranging. They were launched in November 2020 by 53 members, which were co-convened by Canada and Costa Rica. Now, TESS emerged because of this recognition among a core group of countries that environmental crises and degradation are having impacts on trade, on economic resilience, and on supply chains. But also because of the recognition that trade has a range of impacts on the environment. There's also recognition that many countries are taking environment-related measures that impact trade and therefore warrant discussion. And also that existing trade policies can both hinder action on the environment or exacerbate environmental harms. On the flip side, there's also a recognition that trade can promote certain environmental outcomes. And we can also use trade policies and rules to incentivize and support environmental action. So why are they discussing this at the WTO and why now? Well, as mentioned by Clara and Zee, there's a sense that we need to upgrade and update the multilateral trading system to ensure that it's relevant to key global challenges, including environmental ones, and that we need to have inclusive discussions. So these topics should not just be dealt with bilaterally or plurilaterally or regionally, but there needs to be a strengthened multilateral discussion around these issues. And then the third reason is that there's the drivers of this initiative have recognized that there's inadequate scope or processes within the WTO to really spur and catalyze the dialogue that is needed on these issues at present. So since its launch last year, TESS-D, as they're called, have provided a space for members to exchange views on a range of issues, share proposals, and galvanize attention to these issues. The meetings have been open to all WTO members, and for a first in a WTO process, they've also provided opportunities for participation by some non-governmental stakeholders and an expanded list of international organizations in some aspects of the work. So the sessions so far this year have involved over 90 members altogether as participants, so more than have co-sponsored either the launch or the ministerial statement. So at present, the co-sponsors include major trading powers such as the EU, China, the United States, Canada, and Japan, as well as the UK and Australia, and a range of developing countries ranging from Colombia and Chile to Fiji, Senegal, and Chad. They also involve several economies in transition, such as Kazakhstan, Moldova, and Albania. So together, the co-sponsors are trying to encourage as many members as possible to join the statement in order to signal the importance of stronger cooperation on environment issues, and also to ensure that discussions going forward are inclusive. So I would note here that the primary focus of TESS-D is to spur intensified dialogue. Co-sponsors have emphasized that the process is intended to complement multilateral discussions in the WTO's regular processes, like the Committee on Trade and Environment. It's really supposed to be an informal space to incubate innovative approaches, and these could then be taken up in relevant WTO bodies. It's not intended as a rulemaking initiative and does not propose or launch any specific negotiations. In their preamble of the statement, the members have underscored the need for inclusive approaches that reflect the circumstances of the diversity of the membership and their development needs. And they've also talked about the importance of taking into account the importance of a just transition and making progress towards achieving the SDGs. So the statement itself, we can come back to it in the discussion, but it lists a range of topics that members have expressed interest in working on. And I think a key, and they've also set out a roadmap for work over the next year. So I think looking ahead, a really key challenge in taking that work forward is to combine the environmental ambition with an approach that engages developing countries as partners, reflects their environment trade-related priorities, and addresses their sustainable development interests. So it's really important. I think this importance of engaging developing countries shouldn't be underestimated. So the next thing to address the question that Clara put to me is how does this effort link to the wider reform agenda? So I would say that the TESD effort is trying to contribute to this wider WTO reform agenda. In the statement, the members stress the importance of environmental sustainability as a central issue for the WTO agenda. And they note that work is not only underway at the WTO in the CTE, but that environment issues arise across the organization. And I think this is one reason why the TESD members were so keen to advance the TESD process, because there's a need to look across the range of committees and rules and processes in which environment issues arise at the WTO. I think it can be, the statement can be seen as a way to strengthen the work of the CTE by bringing more dynamism to discussion of environment and trade issues. It's also important for WTO reform discussion in that these new member-led initiatives signal that while the negotiating and rulemaking functions of the WTO are of course central, there's also, the governments recognize the need for inclusive policy dialogue and problem solving on sectoral issues and specific trade-related challenges as well. And that there's a need for more space for this within the WTO system. I think the other thing is it also may help us think about different ways that we can define progress and what successful outcomes look like in the WTO. So here, the TESD process, for instance, is looking at best practices, voluntary actions, there's pledges and guidelines. And so looking to these as outcomes that could both sustain the relevance of the WTO and support action at the national level without necessarily having to require the negotiation of new rules. So I think just to turn now to the role of the G20, I think the G20 has a really important role in supporting and driving the sustainable development agenda in trade. As Clara mentioned, we have the largest economies and also a diversity of members of the G20. So it's a place that you can tackle some of the tensions that also arise at the interface of sustainable development and trade. Another advantage of the G20 is that you get ministerial or even leader level engagement. So some of the ways that the G20 can support progress is, as they've done in the past year, to highlight the importance of the UN 2030 agenda and the SDGs to the multilateral trading system. In the last statement from trade ministers, they highlighted the importance of fisheries subsidies. They supported the role of the CTE as a forum for discussion at the WTO. They emphasized the importance of aid for trade to support developing countries, sustainability opportunities, sustainable trade opportunities. And they also encouraged and supported the participation of WTO members in processes like TESD and the informal dialogue on plastic pollution. So there's lots of ways. I mean, these have sent really positive signals, and indeed some of the text of the last G20 ministers' statement has been used as a basis for discussion on potential text for the WTO outcome document from MC12, which of course we haven't seen at the moment. But it's important that the G20 provides a place for building some of the consensus that then can translate into WTO discussions as well. That said, I think that we shouldn't we should be aware that while the G20 has 80% of the global economy or global trade that Clara mentioned, it's also not inclusive. It's just 20 countries of the world. And there are many, many more that would like to have an agenda setting role on issues like trade and sustainable development, or at least to be a more active part of the dialogue. And so here, I think on particular issues such as climate and trade, it's important that we harness the energy of the G20, but also look beyond it as well. So in some of my work, I've argued for a trade ministers coalition for cooperation on climate action. And here the idea is there is a need for ministerial engagement and leadership to promote sort of constructive dialogue and cooperation that will ensure that trade and trade policy work for climate mitigation and adaptation. And we really need a vehicle like for cooperation to ensure that climate actions don't unnecessarily harm trade, they don't unfairly burden developing countries or exacerbate trade tensions. But to my mind, ideally, a coalition would include the G20 members, which are the main contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions, but also equally a diversity of non-G20 countries of different levels of development from all regions. And here, I think the key is to be more inclusive than the G20. We need to ensure countries that are most vulnerable to impacts of climate crisis are at the table, as well as those particularly impacted by trade-related action on climate, and also those that are championing efforts to align trade with climate goals. And we can talk more about that perhaps in the Q&A. But I think what the G20, this G20 plus or G20 plus non-G20 coalition could really serve as a focal point for the kind of ministerial level dialogue needed to solve tough and complex issues around competitiveness, fairness, transparency, and coordination on trade and climate policy intersections. And this kind of ministerial level dialogue can provide impetus and support and political leadership to the kind of work that may happen at the WTO on issues of trade and climate in the context of the TESD discussions. So quickly, to conclude some takeaway messages, we have important opportunities at the WTO. The WTO is just a piece of a wider puzzle for aligning trade and sustainable development. Wherever we discuss environmental sustainability issues, we really need to be both ambitious and inclusive. Moving these issues forward will require political level leadership, and the G20 can be a stepping stone for consensus building, but we will need more than the G20 in order to secure inclusive approaches. And then just finally, I think it's important to underline that stakeholder engagement will be critical. Making progress on an environment agenda and a trade agenda that affects sustainable development concerns will require much greater leadership at the national level and engagement and advocacy and policy analysis from the business sector, from researchers, from NGOs and so on, to really provide a clear analysis for governments on where the challenges and opportunities lie. And this will also require greater coordination within governments at the national level between environment, trade, and development ministries to make sure that they can advance an agenda at the international level that's coherent. So I think I'll leave it there, Clara, and hope that provides some good food for thought.
That's excellent food for thought. Many thanks. Really interesting. And thanks, for showing how there are entry points in the WTO for promoting sustainable development objectives as part of a broader puzzle, and for stressing the role of G20 plus coalitions, but underlining also the key role of the G20 going forward. And because of this, we are happy to have two representatives now lined up as the next two speakers from the two countries that will actually take over the G20 presidency in the coming years, Indonesia and also India. And next on the agenda is Sabia Saha from RIS, the Research and Information System for Developing Countries in India. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here in the session and to give you the floor to share your perspective on how the SDGs could be better embedded in WTO rules from your perspective. Over to you, and many thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Clara, for brilliant introduction, and also to Professor Said. I remember working with Society and Excel and others as part of our T20 engagement task force back in 2019 and thereafter on some of these very pertinent questions about the WTO reforms. And as I can perceive that we were all warming up for the MC12, and suddenly it has now been postponed. But definitely in our thoughts and in our actions, we are still part of the process, I believe. And there are definitely issues that are very much live on the agenda and that needs to be taken forward. This connection that we have brought in terms of what role G20 can play in the WTO reforms agenda, as well as in terms of the overall trade governance architecture per se, and the multilateral framework is a very pertinent one, and I'm happy to be participating in this particular discussion today, where we are actually talking of about two very important multilateral processes and how both complement each other. If not, we have to find ways to make them, we have to breach the gap that's there in terms of the discussions that are happening as part of the G20 and the well-intended actions that are being taken up as part of G20, and definitely the larger malice with the global institution that is the WTO, which has been a very important endeavor, nevertheless, in starting with the GATT rounds that saw more or less uniform approaches and convergence on several fronts, but thereafter the divergences have multiplied. The fact that G20 needs to bring convergence is very important, as we know that G20 comprises of the advanced countries as well as the large developing countries like India. In terms of trade interests, the divergence that have multiplied can be, around the more prominent issues that we talk about today, be it agriculture, the fisheries subsidies, or the participation in the WTO reform process per se. But starting with how we place the proposals and how we interpret the proposals coming from different country groupings are very important. Starting with G20, the US has set very ostentatious criteria to drop large developing countries from the SNDT bracket, the special and differential treatment bracket, linking their very participation in G20 as an yardstick. To put things in perspective, if I may, some of the responding proposals that have come from the developing country groupings, that includes India, has pointed out that if we look at the long time series, between 1994 and 96 and 2014 and 16, for large developing countries like Brazil, Indonesia, India, the gaps in per capita incomes with that of the US has increased over 70%, and with Germany it would be around 43%. So if we carefully read the proposals that are coming from the developing countries, including that of India, there is a clear statement on how the need for preserving the space for special and differential treatment, and how not to inherit the historical imbalances that we see at this point. G20, of course, has risen to the occasion. In the last 2 to 3 years, there has been a lot of focus on pandemic response, on climate change. The emphasis on multilateralism needs to be of topmost attention, and G20 has that scope to play that role in terms of upholding multilateralism away from the kind of regional processes that we are looking at. It is not that the regional processes are not important. It is not. Those are important for creating regional public goods, but at the same time, when we are talking about the imbalances, the inequities, the multilateralism per se has a lot of importance. Dr. Clara has already mentioned about 4 entry points. If I may add, there could be a 5th entry point to this whole question. We need to have the development working group of the G20, which has already adopted the action plan on 2030 agenda for sustainable development, that has talked about finance and technology more prominently, but needs to incorporate and bring in trade debates as part of its deliverables. As we know that there has been a focus this time around the preparation towards the MC12 to mainstream aid for trade. The developing countries, the difficulties faced by developing countries in terms of aid for trade, getting addressed with the joint, the coming together of institutions like the IFC and the WTO coming into a sort of agreement. But our own analysis over the longer term period, if we look at how trade integration has happened for developing countries and LDCs, it clearly shows that aid for trade alone is not enough. With countries that have enjoyed and could take advantage of special and differentiated treatment, the rate at which their share in global trade went up is much higher compared to what we see in terms of provision of aid for trade alone in case of some of the LDCs. And the divergence that we see in terms of industrialization, in terms of developing countries benefiting from trade, has perhaps to do with which mechanism worked well for these countries. Aid for trade remains important, but at the same time, special and differential treatment mechanism would be important. It is heartening at this point because, as we know, that Indonesia has just taken up the G20 presidency, and I see Professor Damuri on the screen, who participated in the RIS forum just 2 days back. Indonesia has tried to give it a much more clearer focus when we talk about development and the sustainability issues connecting to trade, which is, I think, the G20 presidency with Indonesia would have a lot to deliver on this front. Some of these questions that we are discussing today have been captured as part of the recently launched World Trade and Development Report from RIS, around which we have had some couple of webinars in the past week. This report is up on the website, and we have tried to address some of the questions regarding the interface of trade and technology, the role for SNDT, the question on WTO reform, and others. So before trying to emphasize on the urgency of the SDGs, reversal of gain, decade of action, building back better, we need to also focus on WTO as an institution per se. So we are struck with the continued stalemate, no question about it. But is it too big to fail at this point, as we always say? What's the impact of the social and political capital that has been accumulated over the years around WTO? We have seen how, as we say, quote unquote, Trumpism was in full display even recently, and how continued marginalization of developing countries have been a key bottleneck in the process. The push for plurilateralism and the plurilateral agreements, as we see, to my understanding, have still not reached fruition. And there are several frictions in the process. One of them is, of course, suboptimal participation of developing countries. And again, even if they're participating, much of the process is driven by developed countries. And a whole lot of recent analysis around the e-commerce discussion and the JSI is a clear reflection of that. We have also been talking about the RTAs and FTAs in terms of creating other hurdles for the multilateral trade engagement. But as we see the pandemic unfolding, as we see the challenges to the supply chains, we also see that further fragmentation of trade governance is also taking place, which is still not under the purview of the kind of discussions that we are having at this point. The rise of multilaterals at this point is of a significant consequence. WTO may not be such attractive to political leaders at this point because of several domestic issues and domestic interests. But for researchers, WTO remain an important platform because through WTO proposals, through notifications, and through the documentation that happens at the WTO, we actually get a sense of the national interest and where it pinches for the countries to begin with. So it is important to understand that the extent of compliance with MFN principles are going to be difficult in the future if the kind of frictions that we see going on. It is important to understand what kind of metrics we are looking at, be it poverty, be it hunger, inequality, informality, access to technologies, because SDGs remain the guiding principle, and the WTO countries have come, like WTO SDGs, countries have already committed to the SDGs. when the Doha development round was launched, it was around the MDGs, but there is hardly any scope at this point to take the SDGs holistically. That we definitely see, because if we have to have the SDGs as the prime focus, we need to have the holistic perspective in place. You know, with WTO and doldrums, iniquitous impact of trade not attended, it is fairly clear that SDGs cannot be achieved within the due date. The concentration of poverty and hunger in the LDCs are a key consideration, even in the countries that are graduating from their LDC status. And agricultural livelihoods remain the mainstay, along with activities like fishery, as we have already noted. The judgment is wide open here. OECD's own report suggests that there is a huge disparity in terms of subsidies that are provided to these sectors in developed and developing countries. On agricultural livelihoods that are most vulnerable, it is also important to reconsider the need for making WTO relevant for the contemporary world, in a sense that agreement on agriculture has to be compatible with the climate change challenges. The developed country agriculture, including the meat and dairy industry, is contributing around 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. The AOA, the Agreement on Agriculture, would have to be reformed to discourage the 20th century production structure and create new incentives for accessing modern, cost-effective technologies for greener and sustainable agriculture. With this MC12 getting postponed for the time being, the wait for developing countries, as we all know, on the question of vaccine equity gets longer. The WTO needs to find a mechanism at this point. I'm told that virtual meetings are difficult at this point because of very disparate time zones that are out there. But with the fear of the Omicron looming large, there has to be an urgent solution to the kind of waiver that some of the countries have sought in the process. The current set of proposals for the WTO reforms coming from the US, the EU, and others, are clearly focused on widespread repeal of the SNDT. Now there is also certain criteria being set. I'm not going into the self-declaration debate because that is fairly well known to everybody. But what kind of criteria do you devise? The need-based criteria also has is a myopic approach to my view. The long-term needs of the developing countries are not getting reflected in the kind of the technical specificities that are coming in terms of devising the criteria for recategorization of the countries in terms of their SDGs, in terms of their special and differential treatment. The issue of reverse SNDT, as well as the special carve-outs that have been enjoyed by some of the developed countries, have also not been factored in the process. And at the same time, when we say that the recategorization of countries for enjoying the special and differential treatment provisions, it need not be a sentimental issue. It is not about the passionate debate, because we heard in the opening plenary today how there was an accusation about developing countries not being prepared with a lot of evidence to suggest the need for special and differential treatment, but which is not correct to suggest. The liability, just 2 minutes. That's fine.
1 minute, perhaps, to conclude.
1 minute. I'll just conclude. Yeah. So just to conclude, special and differential treatment and the provisions likewise have been part of the multilateral trade negotiations right from the Havana Charter, and that is something that we need to take cognizance of. And finally, what we do about such provisions, whether we take care of issues for the developing countries that are still catching up, empowering the citizens and improving their livelihoods, going up the technology ladder, that is very, very specific, very, very important at this point, and accessing technologies, resources for sustainable transitions. These are issues that have been sidelined. It is sad, but WTO needs to bring back some of the issues that are still very important, even as we take up new issues. With this, I end my remarks here.
Thank you very much, Savia. Many thanks, and lots of food for thought, and also many questions in the chat. in the interest of time, we won't be able to actually give you the word to spell out these questions, but please keep typing them and we'll pick them up after our next speaker's input. And it's now my great pleasure to welcome you, Jose Rizal Damuri, from the Indonesian Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And it's our great pleasure to have you here, also in light of the fact that you are in the lead for the Indonesian G20 process, together with the University of Indonesia next year in the context of the upcoming Indonesian G20 presidency. Congratulations, and it's great to have you here. And we're looking forward to hearing your perspective on what we should expect from the Indonesian G20 presidency to align in terms of aligning trade and sustainable development objectives. And you do have slides. Please feel free to share them, but also please try to stick to your 10 minutes so that we have time for Q&A with all the other participants in this round. Many thanks, and over to you.
Okay, thank you, Clara. Thank you for a very kind introductions. It's really nice to be here with some of familiar faces and also with new friends and colleagues to talk about a very important issues, trade and sustainability, sustainable development goals. So since the Clara's questions is about what we should expect from Indonesia G20 process on the aligning the trade and sustainable goals. So I decided to use a small presentations, PowerPoint presentations, just actually to clarify the points, because I also would like to have a chance to use this chance to introduce some of the Indonesia's G20 theme and agendas, especially related to trade and sustainable development. So here is my presentations. It's just a very short presentations actually. Presentation material. So basically, what I would like to introduce you is to the G20 Indonesia Green Teams. Indonesia would like to take up the team recover together, recover stronger. From these teams, you can see that the focus is still on the recovery. But Indonesia also try to bring this recovery focus into 3 pillars, which is promoting productivity, increasing resilience and stability, and ensuring sustainable and inclusive growth. So you can see that the sustainability is an important part of the Indonesia green teams for the G20 next year. Of course, it would be discussed in many those teams. Those main agenda would be discussed under various working groups, like we know that the G20 works at as a bottom up process, where working groups normally led by ministers who would deal with specific issues and then it would be taken up to the leader. But normally G20 also produce quite lengthy communique or leaders declarations, and sometimes it would take a lot of times to just read the leader statement. Like, for example, the G20 Italy come up with, I think, around 60 priorities in the leader statement. But Indonesia is trying to find a way to focus more on certain issues. That's why, in addition to the agendas of the G20, Indonesia also have some focus agendas on the G20 process next year. The first ones are still related to the health and recovery process. The second one is on the digital economy transformations. But more interestingly, because especially it links with what we're discussing today, is that Indonesia put energy transitions and also sustainable development into the focus agenda of G20 next year. Under those focus agenda, Indonesia expect that there would be some concrete deliverables, not only just a statement from the leaders, but rather some kind of action plan that perhaps G20 members can take up into concrete implementations. Like, for example, in the energy transitions, Indonesia expect that the G20 leaders would also discuss about how to finance energy transitions, especially through greater private and public sector collaborations, and so does with other agendas in this focus area. And now let's take a look at what the proposed agenda on trade and investments, since our sessions today discuss more on trade issues. So normally the agendas on trade in G20 are discussed under the Trade and Investment Working Group. But Indonesia proposed to expand the scope of discussions by not only taking up trade and investment, but rather also incorporating industrial and production related agenda into the scope of discussions for this working group. But the focus of attention still on how trade can support stronger, inclusive, and sustainable recovery. And it also emphasized the importance of multilateral cooperations, especially in rebuilding trust and widespread recovery, because as we know, that's what we are having problem so far, especially on trade issues, on how to build trust, rebuild trust, while we actually need to have the stronger trust in order to support the recovery. And Indonesia basically in its agenda also realized the difficulties of striking balance between promoting the role of trade and investment, especially during this recovery process, especially in mitigating economic slowdown at the one hand, and the risk of deteriorating environmental conditions on the other hand, especially during this recovery era. Like, for example, we've seen that the energy prices already went very high, and for countries like Indonesia, who also produce a lot of fossil fuel energy, it's very tempting to use trade in order to mitigate economic slowdown by pushing and promoting trade on fossil fuel products. But of course, it would run the risk of deteriorating environmental conditions. So with that, perhaps you can see more detailed elaborations about the agenda on trade and investment. Indonesia would like to have, of course, definitely the stronger multilateral trading systems would be in the agenda and would be discussed more intensively under Indonesia's presidency, including also WTO reform. Yeah. And how to make the multilateral trading systems become the central of a trading system and trading arrangement again. Other aspects of sustainable issues including on the supply chain, sustainable investment, and sustainable industry would also be incorporated in the discussions with Indonesia. So with that backgrounds, how going back to the questions, so what should we expect from Indonesia's G20 process in order to align the trade and sustainable issues? I'm not going to answer it for sure. It's a very difficult situation. But let me perhaps if I put some challenges and prospects, perhaps we can also discuss it further later on in the question and answer. There are many challenges for sure, especially when we're talking about sustainability. Perhaps there is different perceptions on the focus of sustainability in trade, especially between the developing countries, the developing economies, and developed economies. Like for example, in the developing economies, the sustainability issues often being emphasized into or being incorporated into the aspect of social and economic inclusion, while in many developed countries it can also be interpreted more on the environmental and climate issues. This is just a very simple simple distinctions, but we can also see that kind of distinction, especially on the focus of discussion on the sustainability in trade issues. The second ones, perhaps I should also mention that the many developing economies, including also Indonesia, still very reluctant to use trade measures, especially in climate mitigation. Yeah. The concern is over unnecessary and also sometimes unjustifiable, and the concerns over discriminatory effects of those trade measures in climate mitigation.
I don't want to interrupt you, but can you try to wrap up? The slide is really interesting. Sure. Can you try to wrap up in a minute or so?
In just 1 minute. Okay, okay, Clara. Also, for sure, the tensions and the dynamics of trade relations that can also be an obstacles to reach concrete actions. However, there are some prospects on it that we can expect perhaps from Indonesia's presidency. The first one is that Indonesia, as I mentioned before, try to focus on concrete actions. That's why Indonesia puts also high priority in finding balance between the use of policy measures and actions, especially action plan on capacity development on sustainability issues. Indonesia also supports concrete actions toward the WTO reforms, as Clara also already explained to us. That WTO reforms would allow the MTS to deal with sustainable issues more effectively, and Indonesia also has a quite concrete agenda, quite concrete proposals for G20 in order to support the WTO reforms. And Indonesia's comprehensive approach by including industry and productions should also be quite beneficial to take up the sustainability issues, especially from the value chain perspective, and to put it not only as a under the trade issues or under trade aspects. So with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and don't forget to visit our website, T20 Indonesia website at info.t20indonesia.org. You can find some information, especially for the call for policy brief so we can so you can participate more on the T20 process. Thank you very much, Clara.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for sharing these insights into the upcoming priorities of the G20 presidents in Indonesia, and for linking us to the T20 process, where all think tanks and research institutions can participate. Many thanks. So yeah, now it's time to open the discussion with all the participants in this virtual round. And we've received a number of interesting questions in the chat. And I think we'll start with the first set of questions addressing Caroline, and questions on the environment and environmental sustainability in the WTO. And in the interest of time, I'll just mention the questions briefly, and then I'd like to ask you, Caroline, to share your perspectives. We know that you have another event lined up at 3 p.m. in just a good 20 minutes on regional perspectives on these environmental initiatives in the WTO. So more to come from you if you're interested in these issues in particular. So the first question is, well, what about the role of the Committee on Trade and Development? Do they, from your perspective, can they play a role in enhancing inclusivity? And can they actually encourage or support developing WTO members to participate in discussions regarding trade and environmental sustainability? So the role of the CTD, that's the first question. The second question is, what about the WTO and ensuring better that key trade issues are more impactful in a positive sense for SDI? And then the last maybe million-dollar question is, the postponement of MC12 was, of course, a huge blow for many issues, including the overall relevance of the WTO. So from your perspective, Caroline, and perhaps others, what needs to be done in the short, medium, and long run to keep momentum going, especially in the area of trade and environment, where we've seen more dynamic initiatives recently? So many thanks, Caroline, and over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Clara, and thank you for the very good questions. I mean, I think I'll take the last one first, is that obviously the postponement of MC12 is a blow to people working on multilateral trade. There are many issues that needed attention, that warranted attention, setting beside, you know, the environment one, whether it's on the pandemic, on agricultural reform, on fisheries subsidies. I mean, there are important issues on the table that needed attention, and also the long-standing development concerns that Jose and Sabiaya highlighted. I mean, you know, there's work to be done. I don't think the fact that the pandemic postponed this one we shouldn't overread that as yet another sign of the failure of the WTO. It wasn't the failure of the WTO. It was the fact that we haven't dealt with the pandemic that has got us in that postponement. So I don't think we should overread that. The DG has rescheduled it for 3 months from now, for early March. I'm sure she'll be determined to set something up again. So I feel for now, our focus has to be on getting on with fixing the issues that were already on the agenda. I think on the environment and trade front, the countries that are supporting the sustainability initiatives, and that includes, as I said, a diversity of the membership, there will be an interest in moving those forward. They have indicated that they're still looking to how they could do that, either in the coming weeks or in the lead up to MC12, and so we just have to see what happens. But I don't think, certainly whether or not those statements get formally issued, there's a great desire to move the work forward and to keep that momentum going. So I think we can expect that work to advance. On the CTD, it's an excellent question. As I tried to mention in my statement, the reality is that environment issues arise across the WTO's work. They arise in this Committee on Trade and Development to the extent also that committee examines issues like technology transfer, which obviously environmental technology transfer is important to many developing countries, tackles issues like trade finance, comes up in discussion. So obviously trade finance is important for green exports from developing countries. And also they're responsible for overseeing the WTO's work on aid for trade. And so here there has been discussion of circular economy issues in the Committee on Trade and Development. In general, however, I would say that we have not been successful in engaging developing countries or hearing their voices, or listening to or when we hear their voices, recognizing that this is their agenda and that these are the issues that they want to be on the agenda. And so we should find ways to have a more integrated discussion, To my mind, the TESD process is a way of doing that. As I said, you have environment comes up in the TBT committee, the agriculture committee, CTD, all these different places, but there's nowhere where we have a very integrated discussion on that. But by all means, we should try and seek ways. I know the current chair of the Committee on Trade and Development and the past one have been both actively interested in trying to make sure developing countries' voices are heard in these discussions. So I think more can be done. I think I'll stop there because you have many others who need to speak.
Thanks so much. Great. Then I'll turn to you, Sabia. We've heard many interesting trade and development questions raised in the session so far. And in the chat, there has been a discussion on this distinction between, or the definition of developing countries in the WTO, or the lack of a definition. Of course, there are many interesting issues around SDT, special differential treatment, but this is one of the key questions, of course, that is also undermining progress potentially on trade and development issues in the WTO. So what's your perspective on this? Isn't the strict distinction between developed and developing countries increasingly unhelpful in the current WTO context? That's Axel's question. For example, countries like China and Brazil are key promoters of the plurilateral negotiations on investment facilitation and should have an interest in supporting poorer countries in implementing such an agreement through technical assistance. And then Claudia Schmucker is asking, what do you think about the approach to abandon a general S&D treatment in favor of negotiating individual commitments and sensitivities, like in the trade facilitation agreement? At the same time, we might reply, as Axel does, it's not clear whether it's a good idea to abandon special differential treatment altogether, but more flexibility could be introduced and might be helpful. Sabia, what's your take on more flexibility when it comes to special and differential treatment?
Yeah, these are questions that we definitely face regularly when we discussing special and differential treatment, because we are increasingly seeing the divergences among the developing country groups that are coming up in terms of their engagement with the plurilateral groups that are coming in. But we should also remember at this point that the nature of special and differential treatment, I'm not talking about the reverse SNDT that is already happening, because once we take into account the nature of the discourse changes, but solely keeping it to the developing countries and special and differential treatment, we need to understand that the nature has changed a lot. You know, we are no longer talking about non-reciprocal commitments. We are actually talking about the flexibilities that you have just mentioned in terms of the longer timelines, in terms of specific sectoral specificities that we bring into the provision, because SNDT cuts across every agreement of the WTO. So there is a need to look at whatever is part of the agenda as a part of each of these agreements, but definitely coming to what Claudia mentions about whether we postpone or we abandon SNDT for a new framework on flexibilities, you know, our analytical studies shows that it is not helpful. It is, as I have mentioned in my earlier presentation, because we have tried to work on this in terms of what kind of compensation mechanisms do you devise if you replace SNDT treatment? If you have what kind of aid flows do you need to take care of? What kind of ODA flows you need to take care of? What kind of, you know, if you take SDG 17 in totality, whether aid for trade alone would be helpful in helping developing countries and least developed countries to integrate more with the world trading system, the answer is no. So you need broad-based flexibilities when it comes to accommodating developing countries. And in terms of the clearer definition of developing countries, I don't think there is, there has to be a debate, because SDGs have not been achieved. We know where we stand in terms of the SDGs, where we know what kind of poverty picture is, where poverty is concentrated, where hunger is concentrated, what kind of informal economy we are looking at, what kind of unemployment figures we are looking at. So I don't think developing country needs to be identified separately, but at the same time, there is a larger cause that is coming in terms of the global south. So with this, I think that's my response to the questions that have been raised.
Thank you very much. So food for thought for more debate on this is needed, and more debate on this is needed. Thank you so much. Yeah, turning to you, Jose. There's a question about the G7 agenda of the German presidency and the G20 presidency of Indonesia, and overlaps between key issues on the agenda, including health, including the energy transition, including WTO and WTO reform. Yeah, what's your perspective on reaching out between these two presidencies? Is there some outreach planned? And from our perspective at the German Development Institute, it's of course, we will be actually leading the German G20 process together with the Global Solutions Initiative in the upcoming German presidency. But our aim is always to also build bridges to the G20 and the T20 to make sure that we link up to this broader and more inclusive forum. And so we would be interested to hearing in your last answer before we conclude the session, your response on connections between the two presidencies.
Okay, thank you, Clara. For sure, because correct me if I'm wrong, but G7 members are all also included in the G20. So that would automatically translate it into a G20 agenda and discussions. And I'm not from the government, but I think the government of Indonesia would start the discussions of G20 Sherpa. I think early this month, December, so that perhaps on that occasions, Germany and also Indonesia can share and discuss about the link between G7 and G20 more elaboratively.
Many thanks. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing your perspectives, your excellent inputs. Thank you for being part of the session. And I'll hand over to Said for his final remarks. Thank you. A big thank you from my side to all of you, and also to all the participants in the session and their questions and comments. Many thanks.
Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Clara. I think we have many issues to further discuss because we have limited time, but two things I would like to remind: that the WTO reform, without focusing specifically on the sustainability issue, will be lacking to keep the WTO relevant to our realities today. And secondly, the trade measures. In the context of trade, there should be a delicate balance for trade measures to protect the environment and to protect trade. And this is the second point I would like to raise. And let me thank to our panelists for their contribution and all the attendees for their remarks and for their valuable questions. And last but not least, the TURN network is grateful to IISD and its staff, of course, for organizing this excellent hub. And I wish everybody a healthy and good day. Thank you.